this morning. The title of this one is called A Tale of Two Builders. Now, let's begin with the parable of Jesus. It's in Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 24. Therefore, Jesus speaking, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down. Side note here, I had no idea they were going to play that song about this parable. It is so bizarre when things like that happen. You plan something, and then you don't work it out with someone else. They do their planning, and the things coincide. So it put a big smile to my face this morning when they were singing that particular worship song. Now the rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Which foundation would you prefer to build on? Here's what Jesus says. What you build your life on matters. That is what this parable is all about. If we could summarize it in one phrase, here's what Jesus is saying. What you build your life on deeply, deeply matters. Now, let me illustrate this for you. I have a video for us here this morning. I found this one as I was doing one of those Google searches. If you're a homeowner, I apologize in advance. Yeah, as Jesus says in his parable, what you build your life on matters. You use the wrong construction company. You use the wrong composite. There might be problems further down the line. You get the foundation wrong, as we saw in this video here. Luckily, none of us, Northeast Connecticut, we have a house up there. All right, hopefully we're okay here in lower New York. But that's too close for comfort still for us here in New York. You hear Connecticut, you're like, oh my goodness, is my foundation okay? You get the foundation wrong, the whole building is affected. Here's a picture of a home that crumbled because why? The foundation was improperly built. You could have the most beautiful home. It could look great on the outside. You could adorn it with all sorts of items and flashy bells and whistles. You can spend all the money on the exterior of the house, yet if the foundation is wrong, here's what you could possibly be left with. This parable is a harsh warning. It's a challenge. On the other hand, if you get the foundation right, if you build the bottom properly, well, then the house should be able to withstand the rains, the wind, the storms that inevitably will come in life. Get it wrong, disaster. Get it right, I wouldn't say smooth sailing, but you have this type of life that can withstand all the struggles and challenges that we will face. So this parable, as all parables are, here's the thing about parables, they aren't easy words, they aren't nice stories, they're not nice fables or children's tales. They are challenging, and they elicit a response from the listener. As we listen, as we read a parable, as we hear a parable spoken, as we dive into these words of Jesus, there is a response that Jesus is calling for. For this particular parable, it's, well, what exactly will you build your life on? Now, here's how Jesus begins the parable. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. This is the opener for the parable. This is how Jesus kicks this parable off. It's the introduction for the story that he's about to tell. Now, 2 notes here with this one sentence. First, that phrase puts them into practice. If you notice, Jesus does not say, if you listen to this parable, if you hear this parable, if you memorize this parable. I remember when I was in Sunday school growing up, we had that flannel board. Anyone else flannel board Sunday school? You remember those? And the teacher would put that, it wasn't quite Velcro, they would just attach it there, and then they would show you, okay, here's the person that doesn't build their house on the rock, and here's the sand, and then their house gets blown away, it gets washed away by the streams and all the rain, but yet here's this other person. I remember this parable, but Jesus is not saying, hey, if you memorize this thing, you're going to be okay. If you memorize this, well, then your life can withstand. No. Jesus says something much more profound. If you listen, hear, memorize, and put into practice. If you live these words out. Jesus constantly was inviting his first listeners and us today into a way of living. Not a way of thinking, not a way simply of believing, but a way of living your life. Jesus is saying, if you arrange your life around these words of mine, if you arrange your life around these teachings, then you will build a life that can withstand whatever happens to be thrown your way. The words of Jesus can't just stay in your head. They can't be nice things that you affirm and believe. They must be embodied. Which, if you get to the actual Greek word that's used for belief, is what that Greek word is getting at. It's not an intellectual belief, not a theoretical belief, but it's a belief, something that you believe with your whole body. Jesus is saying, if you embody these teachings, if they become a part of who you are, and we've all seen the difference. We all know the difference between thinking something up here and believing it with your entire being. Now, second note about the opener to this parable. What words could Jesus possibly be talking about? If you put these words into practice, okay, what words is Jesus talking about here? This parable serves as the conclusion to the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount, I like to liken the sermon to Jesus' greatest hits. And the Sermon on the Mount, it comes in the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. Almost as if he's saying, I'm going to tell you all where my life is going. I'm going to tell you certain ways to live and to arrange your life, and then I am going to show you how to live them out. And that's typically how it works. You hear something up here, you might believe it, you think it's inspiring, and then you're like a toddler learning to walk. You begin to put it into practice. And I think that's how it works with the way of following Jesus. There are certain ideas and teachings that you hear of Jesus, but then you're a bit wobbly for a while because some of the things that Jesus teaches, they don't come naturally to us all the time. They have to become a particular way of being. It's not just overnight you sleep and wake up the next morning and you're like, oh, I've got all of this under control. No, it takes time. So Jesus, the very, very beginning of his ministry, is saying, let me show you where this is going. Let me show you what I'm going to continue to show you for 3 years while I'm here on earth. And let me give you a compelling, beautiful picture of the type of life that I am inviting you into. The type of life that we are still being invited into today as followers of Jesus. And just like this parable teaches, the Sermon on the Mount, it is foundational to the life and ministry of Jesus. Jesus didn't go to that nasty quarry in Connecticut. He didn't use whatever that construction company was that poured that faulty cement. Jesus was building his life on something that was stable and sturdy. And that is what the Sermon on the Mount is all about. It's almost like this giant manifesto. You read these 3 chapters in Matthew, and I mean, that could keep you going for a lifetime, honestly. Do we need any more than that? You can sit with that for a year and still find yourself inspired and challenged and, all right, I got more to keep walking through. And what Jesus is doing in the Sermon on the Mount, he's offering a new foundation upon which to build. If you notice at the end of that video there, how do you fix a faulty foundation? You have to raise the house up. You give it some support for a while. You remove the faulty foundation, and then you pour a new one. Here's what I'm talking about. Matthew chapter 6, part of the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said. This phrase, you've heard that it was said, Jesus uses it multiple times in the Sermon on the Mount. He is correcting some faulty beliefs. You have heard this. Let me offer you something new and different. You've heard it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. Okay, great. But we're going to lift your house up, and we're going to build a new foundation for you. And I tell you, anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Challenging words. Murder, most of us would be like, all right, good, I have that under control. I'm all set. Angry with a brother or a sister? Ooh, anyone else? You feel that zinger. I'm subject to judgment when I'm angry. Like, I'm okay with the whole murder thing. That's great. But being angry, ooh, I might have to lift that house up and do some work under there. Anyone else? You're there with me on that one. You're like, ooh, okay. Jesus, could we keep it with what you said long ago? I don't know if I'm up for this other part that you're teaching. Now, when Jesus offers this parable at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, what he's saying, and again, this is deeply challenging for all of us, as we just witnessed with that one verse we read. What will you do with what I just taught you? You've heard about the murder moving to anger. Well, what will you do with that? Will you put it into practice? Learn to live this way of forgiveness and finding ways, healthy ways to calm that anger? Or will you simply walk away because you find it too challenging? That's what this parable of the 2 builders is all about. Jesus offers a beautiful picture. Everyone listening there is probably like, I like where this guy is going. We read the Sermon on the Mount and we're like, yes. But then we're forced to confront these words, these teachings. And now the question's being thrown at us. Will we be wobbly in trying to figure this whole thing out? Or will we just walk away because we find it too challenging? Jesus is saying here, what will you build your life on? What will the foundation of your life be? Now, let's do 3 notes on foundations. First thing about foundations, the bigger you want your life to be, the deeper and sturdier your foundation has to be. I did a little research into foundations for skyscrapers this week. Well, first off, hold on, before we get to skyscrapers, let me define for you bigger life. Because sometimes when you hear bigger life, you think, oh yeah, so if I want a bigger house, a nicer car, a bigger closet, if I want more of the optics, the things that others see in life, is that what we're talking about, bigger life? No. Here's what I mean by bigger life. A life that is more spacious, inside. A life where you feel more alive by the day. A life that is richer in experience. Anyone else? Do you want a richer experience of life? I mean, this is what Jesus was teaching. This is what the Sermon on the Mount is all about. How about a fulfilling good life? Who wants to sign up for that type of life? A life where you lay down at night and you're like, that day fulfilled me. A life of deep satisfaction. A couple of years ago, we did a sermon series on the Beatitudes, all about the good life. You know what kicks off the Sermon on the Mount? The Beatitudes. Jesus begins this sermon with a picture of what the good life looks like. So if you want that bigger, more spacious, more alive, more fulfilling life, well, then the foundation that you build upon, it must be deeper and sturdier. Now, let's talk about skyscrapers' foundations. And I found this picture right here. And you notice here are some of the taller buildings in the world. And what you'll see here is this graph, this picture. It shows how deep underground the foundation has to go in order to support these tall buildings. Now, because of technology, I watched a whole bunch of YouTube videos on this. Because of technology, there are different techniques that you can use, which allows for a more shallow foundation. But however tall the building goes, it needs more support. And what you'll notice here, second building from the left, the Shanghai Tower, you see how wide that one is? And what about the one over there? It's a building in Dubai. You see how wide that foundation is? These foundations must be built properly in order to support what is above ground. If you're building a foundation for a house, it does not need to go as deep as a foundation does for a skyscraper. But there is a different depth the foundation must have for a one-story building than for a two-story or a three-story building. There are particular building codes that dictate how a foundation must be built depending on how tall the building is. The deeper, the more spacious, bigger you want your life to be, the more sturdy your foundation has to be. 101. But sometimes we forget this. Now, here's something else about foundations. What you'll notice here in this image, they are unseen. They're hidden. Foundations are underground. In the culture we live in, we like to spend our resources on the things that are seen. We do not like to spend money on things that aren't seen because then we can't impress other people. But we saw a picture of that house that didn't put proper money into its foundation. Beautiful home, collapsed. The thing about the life that Jesus was leading his listeners and us into, it's a life that happens under the surface. If you want to have this bigger life, it doesn't happen where others can see. It happens within you. It's unseen. It's hidden. It's underground. It's this interior life that Jesus wants to build within you. The life that Jesus invites us into, this deeper, good life, it's not a life that is visible necessarily for others, but it's what happens in the shadows. It's what happens within you. Here's Matthew, part of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6. You have heard it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Again, long ago, here's what you heard. Don't commit adultery. But I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her. Where? In his heart. It's the hidden life. Adultery, we might be okay with this one. That's what's seen, but yet Jesus moves it from the visible to the hidden. It says the real work, it happens where no one is watching. It happens within your heart. Here's something else in the Sermon on the Mount. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. Oh, hey, everyone, let me write a nice check here and place it in the offering box. Let me make sure that everyone can see how I'm giving to the needy around me. No. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, don't announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others, so others can look and say, what a good person they are. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. It's the hidden life. It's the life under the surface, the life that happens within you. Now, this raises a question for us. How then do you develop this hidden inner life? Luckily, Jesus offers some guidance. It's a life that is developed through reflection, through prayer, fasting, silence, all things that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, retreat, spending time alone by yourself so that you can listen to the Spirit and pay attention to the inner condition of your heart. When's the last time that you listened to the condition of your heart? When's the last time you were silent and you peered inward to assess what was happening within you? We spend a lot of time assessing what's on the outside, on how we appear to others, on how we're making ourselves visible for others to see. How much of our energy is spent reflecting inward and seeing what's happening within us? So here's the second note on foundations. You have to check the integrity of your foundation. I went around my house and I found this crack in the foundation. And I immediately raised the roof. No, I'm kidding. It's a minor crack. It's okay. About a year or so ago, I had a home inspector who came over. We walked all around the house. He was showing me a couple of things. He pointed out this crack. He said, not a big deal. Here's how you fix it. You go to Home Depot. You get some kind of a composite. He said, you break the tube open. He said, do not do this inside your house because the smell will linger for about 2 years. So make sure you keep it far, far away from your home. You do this outside, and then you just put that composite there, and it'll fix it. It's a crack. You get to it now, you're okay. You let this crack linger, and you let it expand, it'll grow. It will destabilize your home. It's much easier to fix things the earlier you catch them. It's the same with our hearts. As we do an integrity check of our foundation, of our inner heart, whenever we start noticing something, if we feel the Spirit pointing to something within our lives, it's a lot more helpful if we begin to address what we are noticing right then and there, as opposed to letting it linger and expand. Water could get into this crack, and then the next thing you know, this crack is double the width that it is right there. So we need to do a foundation integrity check. Jesus, Sermon on the Mount. Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, But a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit. A bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Sounds like a tongue twister. Say that one 7 times fast. Here's what Jesus is talking about when we come to fruit. Now, unfortunately, I think what has happened in our modern world is that whenever Jesus talks about fruit, we think about the optics of what is seen. So you hear about the fruit of someone's labors, the fruit of someone's effort, their work, and we look at all that has been produced, all the output. But I think when Jesus talks about fruit, I think he's talking about something different. Because whenever fruit is talked about in the Bible, you want to know how it's talked about? How do you define fruit? Galatians chapter 5. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance or patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. If we were to do that inner reflection, to peer inward, if we were to ask ourselves, is my life producing this type of fruit? How might we answer that question? Are our lives growing in the direction of this fruit that is talked about? Or are we finding ourselves to be more loving in our interactions with others? In the type of words that we use for ourselves? Do we find ourselves being more filled with joy? What about patience or self-control? I think the way in which we do that foundation integrity check is we begin assessing the fruit that is being produced by our lives. I think what Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount in this parable is, if you put these words into practice, if you work on the anger, well, you'll find yourself being more filled with peace. And so we do that check and we ask ourselves, well, how is my life with peace right now? Am I growing in this area? Or is this an area that I might need to address? And here's the thing about fruit and foundations. It doesn't take a lot for your foundation to begin to crack. And it often goes unnoticed because we are busy in life. We have a lot that is pulling for our attention. We have a lot that is taking us away from times of silence and reflection. Everything is screaming out at us, you don't need silence. You need more noise. And so that shift from good fruit to bad fruit, it's ever so subtle. And it happens without you even being aware of it. I have a picture of a saint from the 4th century, Saint Martin of Tours. Have you ever heard of him before? He is known as the patron saint of charity, giving to those in need. He was also a pacifist. He said, I will not fight. So he was actually fired. He was let go, dishonorably discharged, because he would not fight in a battle. Here's a picture of him. He was a soldier. He saw a beggar in need. He took his cloak off his back and he handed it to someone who is in need of clothing. Now, a couple 100 years later, what happened was his tomb had been raided. This famous cloak had been stolen. And initially, it was looked at as, wow, here is something that reminds us to be charitable. Here is something that reminds us to be loving and peaceful and to show kindness to others, to do no harm to others. Just about 200 or so years later, you know what that cloak was used for? It was used by soldiers fighting holy wars. And the cloak was brought to the front of the army as a sign of God's power with that holy army. So a cloak that had symbolized charity, pacifism, love, and peace was now used to symbolize violence against others. I have a picture. It's not the greatest of picture, but here it is, leading the charge. This happened ever so subtly. Something meant for good. 200 years later, well, now it was used as a weapon against others because it was believed that this cloak held power. When we don't assess the condition of our hearts, this is the natural direction in which we move. Something that was bearing good fruit and meant to continue bearing good fruit in others now had been distorted. And I would argue was being used to produce bad fruit as a way to justify violence against others. Checking the condition of your foundation is important and necessary on a regular basis. And then here's a third note on foundations. The rain and wind will come to threaten the stability of your foundation. No one is exempt from the storms of life. I wrote this book recently, subtitled Surviving Burnout, Creating a Life of Purpose and Joy. As I wrote the book, what I realized, I actually hadn't realized this before I started writing the book, how much I had learned in this entire process of my emails that I was sending and writing. So a couple of years ago, I went through this period where our house essentially had to be raised up and totally cleaned out of all the bad stuff that was in it. And this was a very, very difficult season of life for us. And I remember thinking in the midst of everything, how will I ever get through this? You know how we were able to get through that period? It's because of everything that we had learned in the years leading up to that moment. I had gone through a period of burnout even before that, probably about 5 years or so before it. The lessons I learned from putting my life back together and not wanting to walk down the road of burnout again helped prepare me to make sure that the rain and the wind would not completely destroy my life. So here's another reading from the book. Let me tell you how I put it into words. There were moments, this is when the house was all torn apart. There were moments of despair, and we will all go through moments of despair, no matter how sturdy your foundation is. There will be moments of heartache and pain and despair. So I thought about emailing Rob. I thought about asking for some help. Hey, give me some guidance. I need some help in navigating this situation because I wanted to let him know what I was going through, how I felt lost and needed advice on how to keep going. But as I would think about writing an email, something inside stopped me. There was a voice telling me that I knew what to do. As Rob so often reminded me, the wisdom I needed was right there inside me. This has been my experience with this parable. I had created a life that it wasn't working. I hit a dead end, and I realized I need a new foundation upon which to build. So I started putting into practice new ways of being. And then when a storm came a little bit later down the road, as the storms will come, I had built something that gave me the strength and the power to make it through this situation without completely breaking. I was able to tap into this spirit that was within me, a spirit that's within us, that is leading us down the road that Jesus is talking about. Jesus doesn't just give these teachings and then say, okay, you're on your own, but there is a spirit that travels with us, that guides us. This Holy Spirit that offers wisdom for the journey. Wisdom that helps us build a sturdy foundation so that we can have that bigger, more spacious, more alive way of being. So the question this parable raises is a question for us. What are you building your life on this morning? Do you need to do any demolition? Do you see any cracks in your foundation? And you need to raise the house up a bit and do some of that inner work. Some of the work where you peer within and you look at the fruit and you say, okay, there's some things that need to go, and there's other things that I need to begin putting into practice so I can have this good life, this fulfilling and satisfying life that Jesus is offering.